Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome. You're a precious audience, particularly on a day like today when India's playing against Pakistan in a very, very heated match. A part of me cannot help but wonder what you're doing here, but I am glad you're here, and I'll tell you why. Writing is almost second nature to us. It is so utterly commonplace that we can't help most of the times but take it for granted. But what we forget very often in the process is that the history of writing, which is 5,000 years old, is so intricately intertwined with the history of the evolution of human race that to talk about writing is to talk about everything. And that's exactly what we're going to try and do in 45 minutes and then open it up to all of you to participate in the conversation. I'm going to start with you, Irving. And I'm going to start right from the beginning of the history of writing, the beginning of writing itself, pictography and cuneiform and hieroglyphs. So could you just tell us a little bit about where it originated and how it sort of evolved at the very beginning?
Right. Well, you have to start at the beginning, and it's an archaeological matter, because to trace the first appearance of writing in the world, you rely on archaeology. And as far as we understand it, the first efforts at writing appeared in ancient Iraq, somewhere around 3,500 BC, possibly a lot earlier. Now, the thing about a discussion of writing in 45 minutes with all of us together is you have to have a simple definition to begin with. And as far as I can see, writing itself is a process of making marks on a surface from which another person can retrieve the sounds of the words and the language which are encapsulated in it. This is my simple, everyday family definition. Now, the thing is this. You had a period in the world when there was no writing at all, and this is what people used to call prehistory. And then you have the beginnings of writing, as far as we know, in Iraq, but maybe also somewhere else. And what is true there is that the earliest signs that we can see, we find on clay tablets, are what we usually call pictographs, because in principle they are like the sort of drawings that 3-year-olds do when they first start to draw. So the head stands for a man and legs stand for to walk. And at the very beginning you have a series of very simple marks or symbols from which ideas and sounds can be generated. Now, the good thing about the world is it didn't stop there. It changed from that writing system, preliminary stages, into a beautiful and flexible system whereby the cuneiform writing system developed so that any language could be reduced to syllables with special aids inside it. So in other words, if you learn cuneiform at university, which I hope you will do after this meeting, you will have a writing system which will enable you to write Chinese or Latin or Swahili using this proper writing system. So you have a jump of pictographs, which are simple, elementary, and for children, like emojis, in my opinion. And then you move on to a real writing system. So we don't know whether this process happened lots of times or once. But in my opinion, it is quite likely that there was contact from the original stimulus, because writing appears in Egypt and elsewhere gradually afterwards at a very similar point in time. However, the most important lesson never to be forgotten is that archaeologists don't know anything at all. And one day, a piece of writing might turn up in Russia, which is 30,000 years old, and we'll all be confounded. So this is a danger warning about pontification.
It is my curse to have to go on from that point and pontificate. Okay, so I wanted to, you actually led up to my next question, which was, I was going to ask you if writing originated organically at several different points in the world around the same time, or did you think that there was contact? You clearly do think that there was some level of contact. Given that there are a lot of people of Indian origin and maybe even Pakistani origin in this auditorium, I do want to ask you about the Indus Valley script. And what are your thoughts on why it hasn't, why historians have been able to read it in quite the same way?
Don't worry about that. I'm going to do it, because no one else has done it yet. So I thought I might as well take off couple of days over a weekend and sort it out. Now, the problems are simple. Of course, as everybody understands, like with the Rosetta Stone, if you're going to decipher an unknown writing system, you have to have a bilingual which unlocks the other one. And the problem with the Indus Valley writing is that we don't have such a bilingual. Secondly, the inscriptions are almost unexceptionally very short indeed, so they are almost certainly proper names, and you could never decipher English from a phone book. So the thing is, the archaeologists who enjoy themselves over there and presumably spend most of the afternoon sleeping should get on with finding more inscriptions. There is one big one, a kind of lintel, which shows that the writing system was not limited to seals, but was actually a public information system, because it probably said gentleman's lavatory or something like this. So that writing system is not just for seals, and this is what people think, that because you have seals with it writing on, it's writing for seals, period. But what would happen, which is what I believe to be the case, is that everybody in those cities wrote on palm leaf, because all the palm leaf would disappear, and you'd have a perfectly flexible, wonderful thing with sutras and all sorts of religious philosophy from the year dot, all disappeared, and all we have is these stupid little stamps. So the only answer, there are two answers, I can tell you, but it will take me some time, so you don't mind going home now, do you? Look, I'll tell you one really hair-raising matter. There's a man called Asko Parpala, who's a kind of genius, who used a computer in order to analyze the script of the Indus Valley to find out which of the many signs appeared in conjunction one to the other and which never did. So from this, you can deduce a certain quality about the writing system. The second thing is this, that when Sir Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur in southern Iraq, he found from the same period of the Indus Valley, about 2600 BC, 7 or 8 seals of unicorn type, which they always have the beautiful glyptic, with writing underneath in the Indus Valley writing system where characters were found in conjunction that they never exhibited at home. So this proves beyond any shadow of a doubt this was a phonetic writing system whereby somebody from Mohenjo-Daro ending up in barbarian southern Iraq hearing a bloke's name could write it in their own script in a way that they would not normally do. So that, to me, shows that you are dealing there with a fully fledged, sophisticated writing system. So it just needs some kind of weary, jaded genius, as I say, to take off a weekend and just sort the thing out. So probably sometime at the end of the summer, I'll look into it for you. So.
Cannot wait. I also wish you'd take up archaeology in your spare time, but I'll petition that a little later. All right, one quick question that I wanted to ask you. You mentioned writing on palm leaves. I know you're a big fan of, or I believe, I don't know, you're a big fan of clay tablets. Could you tell us about what the early instruments of writing and what writing was being done on? Tell us about.
Well, in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, when writing first began to preoccupy people with experiments, they used as their support clay from the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, which happened to be of a very high quality and ideal for taking sharp impressions. So it was a clay-based society, and they used it for all manner of things, but they always, for the next 3,000 years or more, wrote on tablets of clay, which, when dry, last forever. So this is why I'm so excited to be in this library, surrounded by vulnerable kinds of records like books and paper and computers, because clay will last till the end of time. So this writing system was more like printing than drawing, because you had to produce the science by impressing it into the surface of the clay. And very often, people sealed a tablet with a cylinder, leaving an impression on it to ratify it. Now, the seals from the Indus Valley, which are stone with a little handle, are obviously the same principle to seal and ratify a document. So I imagine that the documents in India were palm leaf with a string round the middle, then you took a bit of clay, plonked it on the knot and sealed it with your seal. So it would be closely analogous and very understandable.
You know, we think of printing as a fairly modern phenomenon, but would it be a stretch to imagine that the early Babylonians could also have perhaps come upon movable type? Or, I mean, given that you're talking about clay imprints?
They did. You know Nebuchadnezzar, the second king of the world and the biggest man ever born, apart from Boris, of course. he had bricks stamped with a very boring inscription when he rebuilt Babylon to make it into the new rival of Manhattan. Every 10th brick had this, I'm the king of the world, I'm the greatest person, I'm the greatest person. And the way they did it after a while was to cut it in reverse on a stamp. And once upon a time, a lady came to the British Museum with a brick of Nebuchadnezzar, which was very obscure to me at first. And I realized what it was, because some of the signs in the 4 lines were upside down, which means that the stamp which engendered this inscription for us to read had type which could be removed from the matrix and washed under a tap, so to speak, to get rid of the clay, re-put back in to carry on doing it. And somebody put one of them upside down, showing that they actually invented movable type. But the only thing they used it for was this damn stupid inscription. They could have done the whole of Gilgamesh and Lord knows what else, but there you are.
Given that you're the world's greatest living expert, according to me, on everything, but definitely on cuneiform, what is the early content that one is reading in the first couple of decades of writing, and how does that differ across geographies?
Well, in our case, it's a sobering matter, because if you are a poetic individual, you imagine that writing was created by sensitive persons who were struck with the beauty of nature and wanted to make their own ideas clear for the future. But in point of fact, writing came into the world, as far as we know it, by the ancestors of the inland revenue. Because the very first texts that we have are administrative, with totals that some miserable twerp could then add up and check and come after you if you'd got it wrong. So they had their hands on us since the first writing ever was born. And what happened is that other people afterwards realized the potential of this system, and they made dictionaries of signs. They started to make poetry. We can read about the gods. So by 2800, some other brave thinkers started to use writing for literary purposes and other things like that.
Okay, one final question to you before I move on to other speakers as well. I want you to talk a little bit about the evolution of the relationship between languages and scripts from the beginning of writing.
Well, you know, it's a funny thing. In the British Museum up the road, the big sister of this little place, we do a lot of work about writing with the public, and they're all very interested in it. And one of the things is that most normal people, by which I mean normal people, never think of themselves in writing in a writing system. They only think of themselves in writing in a language. And the fact is that writing system and language system are completely and utterly separate. And this is something, when you grasp it, it's rather interesting. For example, in Dunhuang, they found some Chinese manuscripts that looked like all other Chinese manuscripts in columns of writing, which turned out to be in Aramaic. So some scribe who was fluent in the script could transpose the words of Aramaic that some speaker did into Chinese script. So and that illustrates in an extremely lucid way that the language is a language phenomenon and the script is a tool for recording it. And I'll tell you one other thing before they take away my microphone, that my friend Jeremy Black, who did Assyriology in Oxford with Gurney, in the first week was given a list of signs to learn, which of course he could do because he was only 18. And then he had to go home and take the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice and transcribe the words, it is the, and so forth, using the cuneiform writing system. So he laboured over the whole of the weekend and produced this cuneiform transcription using the signs to record the language, not to translate Jane Austen's prose into Babylonian language, but just to use the signs in order to record it. So somebody else who'd never read Pride and Prejudice, but who knew the script, could in fact recite the first chapter by reading those characters.
Just for what it's worth, I'd sooner surrender my microphone than take away yours, but I will bring Michael in at this point in time. You have, and taking off from what Irving was talking about, you have written about allography, and you've in fact written wonderfully about a letter that is written in 2 different scripts. What does this tell you about the relationship between scripts and cultures?
So the letter that I've written about, which is in Writing Making Your Mark, on at the British Library now until August 27th, is actually written in 2 different scripts, but also 2 different languages. So we have the top of the letter that's written in Arabic script, and the bottom of the letter that's written in what's often referred to as Swadaya, sometimes as Neo-Aramaic, a language that's spoken by Christian as well as Jewish communities in northern Iraq, in the Syriac script. So there what we see is someone who's switching between languages, between scripts, and sometimes we know that scripts would have been used, a different script would have been used because it would have been a marker of the identity of the person. A different script might have been used because it was harder to decipher, it was harder to read perhaps on a quick examination. Here, these are two standards. So the majority of Arabic speakers will write Arabic in the Arabic script. Some have not in the past, and some do not today, depending on how you view a language like Maltese, whether it's a dialect of Arabic or a language on its own. And then people who read and write Syriac will often write in the Syriac script. Those who read and write Swadaya or modern languages like Turoyo in southern Turkey might use, for example, the Latin script, the Latin alphabet, because that's the one they're more comfortable with, but it's sort of two dominant different systems. But I think hearing what Irvin's been saying and just thinking about allography, I'm sort of reminded as well of my Linguistics 101 class at the University of Toronto. And we had one lecture that was about writing systems and scripts to complement sort of this general idea of language and it as a phenomenon in society. And the professor showed us the Hebrew script, the Hebrew Abjad, and said, does anyone think that English could be written in this writing system? And the class kind of puzzled over whether or not it was possible, and then started giving all sorts of answers as to why it couldn't be. It doesn't go the right way. It doesn't have vowels. It doesn't look the right thing. Oh, it's got too much history. It's got not enough history. It's too cursive. It's not cursive enough. It's this going on and on and on until the answer, well, of course it can be, because a language like English has been written in it and continues to be written in it. And indeed, Yiddish has long been written in the Hebrew script with modifications and continues to be used. It continues to use that script. And so it brought to the fore that idea that, as Irving said, language and writing systems are separate, but within particular contexts, we conceive of them as being bound together. We see them as being bound together because of the way our cultures teach us that there is a dominant script that we use for a particular language. The way that we conceive of them as being markers, not just of the language, but of our identity. So in Writing Making Your Mark, we have a song sheet from 1911 from this country, from London, where a printing press that catered to the Jewish community, the Yiddish-speaking community, prints a song in both Latin script, the Latin alphabet, and the Hebrew script, and it's the same song. So there you can see that the language could have been written in either script, in either way, but it looks odd to see it in Latin characters because we're taught that's not the script you use for Hebrew, or for Yiddish rather, that there's a particular connection because of the culture, that the script is used as a marker, as a differentiator of our identity, in this particular case of the identity of Jews in London, that this is the language they speak, this is the language that they produce, and it has to be separate from other languages, other dialects and lects and other modes of speech that are produced in the Latin alphabet. So it's such a tightly bound, in a particular context, a tightly bound identification that it's not necessarily language that it's representing, so much as identity, the way we view ourselves and the way we want to be viewed by others.
Because you mentioned identity a couple of times there, I'm going to try and complicate this conversation a little bit and ask you about, at some point in history, we see the emergence of this idea of one nation, one language, and one identity. And even though, of course, there are nation states where most nation states, multiple languages are spoken, there's a dominant language that is sort of politically ascribed to that particular state. I'm curious to understand what this idea, what kind of impact it might have had on the languages, the different languages and scripts that existed at that point in time, and did they suffer at all as a result of this idea?
So I think this is quite an interesting question. I'm going to try not to nerd out and eat up all of the time answering, but so we have sort of two different bodies of literature about this. One that's sort of studying it, so contemporary scholars who will look at languages and the idea of the nation and how they come together, and there are different views as to why language and nation are linked. So why, for example, all Germans, people who are of the German nationality, not just citizenship, should speak German as a reason for why they belong in the state. And then there are others who theorize as to how to build a nation. And so we see various different people who come up, whether they're nationalists, they're socialists, communists, Marxists. And my own particular research has looked at some of the Marxists, some of the socialists, whether the Austro-socialists like Otto Bauer or some of the Marxist-Leninists like Stalin, who enunciate this idea that language is a very important part of forming the nation. And part of that comes into this idea that if you're a nation, you're perhaps an imagined community, to use a contemporary scholar's words. You have to communicate with one another. So if the nation is a body, is a polity, you have to have a means of actually talking to one another. People like Stalin and Otto Bauer also add an economic component. So this idea, Marx himself enunciated this idea that it's sort of the nation is an imagination of an imagined community of the bourgeoisie, a marketplace that's captured and developed in order for the bourgeoisie to develop its factors of production. And so if you're going to develop this space, you need to have a way to communicate to the other members of the nation, and with that you need one particular language. You need one language that you can issue orders in, that they can speak to each other, that you can organize production. Of course, if you're communicating over long distances, you need to do it in a particular writing system. And so often it's the idea of having just one writing system that's directed from the center, that is used to bring the nation together. And so we see different groups have already stumbled upon this idea. So I spoke about Jews with the idea of Hebrew script, Jews using Hebrew script both for Hebrew and for other local languages that they spoke. Around other different countries, other different communities, you have the same thing. So Turkish was predominantly written in Arabic script, but it could be written in Greek script, in Armenian, in Hebrew script, in Runic, as well as Latin. Those are different communities that identify themselves, much as Jews who use Hebrew script Yiddish, as being distinct because of their particular writing system. But as the nation state formed, and they had to be brought together into one particular group as a nation, as the Turkish nation, the tolerance of different script traditions falls out, because everyone has to communicate with everyone else. Everyone has to be given orders or given information from the center, from the state, really, in one way, and that way the state decides is the Latin alphabet. So it's quite a fascinating process that we see, where you need to have this one mode of communication. Obviously, you can write Turkish in so many different ways, but if you're the government and you want to communicate to all citizens in an equal fashion and make them all feel like they're all part of one project, they're going to be bound together in some way, and that way happens to be the Latin alphabet after 1928.
You know, before I bring David in, I want to talk to both you and Irving a little bit about the exhibition that's ongoing in the British Library at this point in time. And I don't know how many of you are aware of this exhibition. I know Michael's mentioned it a couple of times now, but it's called Making Your Mark. Is that what it's called?
Writing, Making Your Mark.
Writing, Making Your Mark. It's a wonderful exhibition. I've seen it a couple of times now. And especially since you've been sitting through this talk, I highly recommend that you go and see it hereafter. But there's one particular aspect of the exhibition that I want to talk to you. I want both your views on what it was like curating that exhibition and what sort of discoveries. I know it's a topic that's very familiar for both of you, but even so, the process of putting something together a lot of times illuminates things, brings up ideas that you might not have been in the forefront of your mind. So if there are any thoughts, please do share that. And particularly one aspect of it, which is through the objects in the exhibition, there is a kind of relationship established between religion and writing. I would also like your thoughts on that.
So I'll try to be succinct.
With Irving as well, so yeah.
So curating this exhibition was both a great blessing and a challenge. It was a challenge because I'm familiar with Turkey and contemporary Turkish history, but obviously, unfortunately, perhaps the exhibition doesn't just deal with that. Perhaps fortunately, if you go through and you might be a bit bored if you have seen 120 objects about writing in Turkey in the 20th century. But so it took all four of us who were curating this exhibition quite a lot of effort, and intellectual and physical effort, to learn about different traditions. Really, we wanted to create something that embraced the history of writing, the histories of writing in various different parts of the world. the different technologies of writing, the different uses of writing. As people, how do we relate to one another through writing? So it meant that we had to learn quite a bit. We learned quite a lot from one another. We learned quite a lot from our colleagues at the British Museum, to whom we're very grateful for their expertise, from a number of different sections on how to interpret objects. We mainly deal with texts that are in book form or manuscript form. So if it's an object like a clay tablet, like a 2-meter tall 1-ton block of stone, the Maya stela, we need their assistance in learning about this. And then there are so many different connections that we discovered as well, connections across regions, across time, different ideas of different peoples, whether the Cherokee, the Vai, various different communities in Africa and Asia, creating writing systems as a way to challenge colonial ideas about prehistory history, about people without histories, without writing, and their inferiority to the metropolitan center. But when it comes to religion, one of the things that was quite interesting that came out from it is, obviously we have this relationship between writing and religion, but it's not as straightforward. It's not nearly as simple as some might think. So we have in the exhibition a number of different objects of wonderful calligraphy from 7 different parts of the world. Many of them are religious objects, and so we see religion has motivated beautiful writing. People who are very pious, people who want to pay tribute and to show their devotion to a particular dogma, a particular faith, will create these incredible objects. There's a 17th century Persian Quran that is filled with gold, with incredible calligraphy. The Ramsey Psalter, one of the great treasures of calligraphy from this country. But we also have to recognize that there are many religions that don't rely on writing. And so we weren't able to provide examples of all of the religions, of even many different major belief systems, because there's a lot in there that's oral. And we have to pay tribute to the fact that religious belief, and Irving can speak about this over the long history, but it's not reliant exclusively on text. And many belief systems continue today that rely on that oral tradition, that eschew written texts, because they're not seen as being ways of continuing an organic faith, an organic relationship to the faith that's defined within that particular community.
Irving, I'd love your thoughts on this. I'm curious, through your work, have you encountered anything that sort of also documents the shift towards monotheism from polytheism in these areas?
Yes.
You might need to use your mic.
Yes. About the exhibition, I thought it was very interesting to be in on it. I would actually like to do it in the middle of the empty reading room in the British Museum, where we have nothing at all, and put all the writing systems of the world all under one roof and make people go ooh and ah, because I think exhibitions should make people go ooh and ah, and I think writing is one of the very few miraculous, extraordinary achievements of the human race, and it should be celebrated in a more articulate, embracing point. As for the relationship between writing and religion, this is a huge topic, but one interesting thing is this, that the Babylonians made lists of everything, including lists of the gods in their pantheon, because they had hundreds of gods, big ones, medium ones, and little ones, and they tried to sort them out, who was who and everything like that. And at the time when Nebuchadnezzar was on the throne, some scholarly priests in Babylon wrote these texts in which they took the 10 or 12 most important of the gods in the pantheon, all of whom had a strong individual identity, such as god of architecture, god of irrigation, and so forth, and they rewrote religion so that all of these major gods with their own temples were but aspects of the one god Marduk, who was moving closer and closer to the Old Testament idea of a single god. So the way they got round it was to give them an office in the administrative bureau of their main god. So this is actually an astonishing matter, especially as you realize that this is when the refugees, so to speak, from Jerusalem, who were taken there by Nebuchadnezzar, were setting up house in Babylonia and encountering these things, and this was exactly their own conception, that there was only one God and all the others were a load of nonsense. So possibly there was an intellectual and religious interface between these communities which stimulated within the old long-running literary traditions of Babylonia the idea that maybe we need to think about this again. So the thing about all these matters you're asking about is that the evidence is so diffuse all over the world throughout all history that all you can do is pick on a single thing like that, for example, but you can't extrapolate from that principles because human beings are so complicated. One other question while we're on this topic. Do you think that the default position for Homo sapiens is to have multi-languages or just one language? This is an interesting thing. When babies are born, you could teach them 7 languages without any difficulty, and by the time they're 8, they can give instructions to the chauffeur in any language you like, which is, of course, an advantage. So human beings have, as part of their apparatus, the capacity to learn a great number of languages, which in this country is totally frittered away by teachers who can't even teach one language. So the other matter is, of course, that big and powerful countries like America are populated by people who only speak one language. They have 2 dialects. One is normal and one is shouting. So when you put this stuff together, you can't really generalize about anything.
Fair enough. David, I want to bring you in. Irving earlier was talking about how well-preserved some of the clay tablets are. You've done work on digital libraries. And I was wondering that this sort of idea that one has that they are really a revolution when it comes to documentation and preservation, does that hold water?
Well, let me just start by saying a word about my own background. Obviously, I'm here to play, you notice the temporal flow here, right? So I'm supposed to be the future, but except that what you need to understand is that I'm trained as a computer scientist indeed, but after I finished my PhD at Stanford in the late 70s, I moved to London to study calligraphy and bookbinding. And I actually have a degree in calligraphy and bookbinding. I'm very interested in the relationship of different materials. And I'm not somebody who thinks that digital has the answer to everything. In fact, what I see is a greater continuity rather than in Silicon Valley, which is what I come out of, everything has to be new, everything has to be different. But in fact, what we're seeing, I think, with digital libraries and digital materials is yet another set of, basically, if you like, and I'm looking at Irving, another kind of clay has been created. And the same work has to be done with this new clay, which is to figure out the modes and the genres of writing in that and how they relate to the earlier ones. And so I don't think that there is actually something quite so remarkably new about the digital world, except for this really, I think, huge political point, which is maybe the main point I can make in the 7 or 8 minutes I have. What's happening in the digital world as a result of this new, not fully formed clay is that old conventions and norms of writing and speaking are being partly dissolved. I mean, look at how we can now shop 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? I mean, or as one example, or how the week and the weekend, certain social constraints are diminished or eliminated. The big question we're facing now in this digital world, which we're still in early stages of it, is when, as we create those new conditions, under what conditions is writing going to be used for the good, and when is it going to be used in dangerous and less helpful ways, right? I mean, I think a perfect example, which I might speak about in another minute, if there's time, is the really challenging stuff that's going on around social media now in terms of politics, certainly in the United States, as the loss of the gatekeepers of institutions like libraries and publishers allowing everyone, quote, everybody, to speak, is leading to a kind of pandemonium in the United States where dangerous actors are coming in to incite tribal differences. So I think what I'm trying to say is we're in a very interesting moment. The clay is not yet formed. And it behooves all of us to begin to understand how we're going to shape that clay for the sake of greater good and not for global pandemonium and disagreement.
Because we started with the hieroglyphs, there is this sort of idea that given the popularity of emojis, it is taking us back to the dark ages of primitive sort of writing. Is that something you'd agree with?
Well, first of all, I mean, I would turn to the true scholars on the panel to respond. Maybe there wasn't a dark age of writing. Maybe that's too simplistic an idea. But if we put that aside, I mean, I think that emojis represent a wonderful explosion of creativity. and offer tremendous potential. My sense is that they arise out of emoticons. Does everybody know and remember the emoticons, the semicolons and all of that, which were originally, I think, intended in the days of email, which we still have, by the way. We haven't left it behind, as a way to add inflection and nuance into discussion when you're on a listserv, when you're actually no longer talking to individuals you know, but you're talking more broadly, to be able to say, I'm trying to be funny, this is a joke, or whatever. And what we see, and I think, by the way, this is one of the reasons why predictions are almost impossible, is that we can't see where all of this is ultimately going. But I think that there's a richness and a life in the colored emoticons that have the potential to represent something very wonderful and exciting that, of course, is being embraced by young people. I mean, most of us have probably gotten a text where we've just said something to someone else and somebody shows a birthday cake or a smiling face or something else, and the immediacy of that feeling, in your body, the emotion that's being represented by that, I think is a wonderfully direct thing. But I don't see that arising as an independent system so much as I see it actually being connected back into our textual systems.
Well, that's a pity. Is everyone in the audience familiar with the myth of the Tower of Babel? Babel, however you pronounce it? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay, so I mean, emojis could well be the first step towards a universal language. Now, I know Irving here is a huge fan of emojis, so I'd like to definitely bring him in and ask him to share a couple of thoughts on it.
In the first instance, emojis are nothing to do with language. They are a simple, fatuous system of communication by people who are A, too damn lazy to say anything, B, totally ill-equipped to express themselves in their own language. If I take a spread of evidence from my own children, if we were going to design emojis from scratch, the first 12 of them would be the word like. And any other word would be almost entirely redundant, because this, in my opinion, is an example of something filling a vacuum when facility in self-expression, mastery of subtle grammar, the ability to communicate real ideas instead of birthday cake, was paramount in the world, Listen, if you take the Oxford English Dictionary, open the huge thing wide, I guarantee that none of you will know more than one word on the whole 4 columns of spread. And the English language, like the Arabic language and the other historical languages in the world, are full of richness where the most subtle distinctions can be expressed by vocabulary, syntax, and the arrangement and the balance of a sentence. And writers know this because that's what they do. And people who use emojis are not only on the edge of becoming robotic, they are halfway down the mine shaft, and I hate them with the passion of my being.
Irving, I'm afraid to say I'm one of those people. So, what can I do? How can I reform myself?
Well, I'm merely on his side because as a writer, I don't get the advantage of being able to, luxury of being able to use emojis. However, final question to all of you. And this, I'd like to start with you, David, but we can now record what's going on as is happening with the session right now on video, on audio. Why should we still think about leaving or preserving or documenting stuff in writing?
Wow. It feels actually almost too obvious to know how to articulate, but I know Irving is going to have a lot to say about it, and I'm sure that Michael will too, so I'm going to leave plenty of time for him to respond. No, I think that all these different modes of communication serve their purposes within the particular cultural milieus within which they were created. And as much as we care about the past, we will care about the various, the writing systems, the forms of content. I mean, I'm a computer scientist, not a historian, but I draw heavily on history. And so, I mean, in a sense, if we want to celebrate the path that humanity has been on and going on, we would never want to lose what people are ultimately trying to say in all the modes and all the materials that we are lucky enough to have.
Michael?
Well, To begin with, I think it's a bit of a red herring to say that because we have these technologies, we're going to lose writing. I mean, we've had the telephone for decades and decades, and we still write to communicate with each other. We still write. I mean, rarely we might handwrite letters, but we still write emails to each other. We still write text messages, including with emojis. But it's still writing at some level with, in order to communicate with one another, despite the fact that you could pick up the phone and call and do it through voice telephony. So I don't think that we have to worry that we're going to give up writing just because we have video recordings and things like that. But at the same time, I think we always make choices, as David said, in our cultural milieus to record or to not record, and why we might want something written down so that those words are there, so that the nuances are there. And I'm thinking in the opposite frame as well, there's a Mexican ethnographer, Fernando Benitez, who, in speaking about the Huicholes, a nation in Mexico, an indigenous nation, says the Huicholes sort of preempted Mexican politics by understanding that sometimes you don't want to record things, and you don't want things written down for posterity. So sometimes we might want to record things, and we'll continue to record things in words because we want to have that nuance and that flexibility of interpreting them, and sometimes we won't because, as I'm sure every politician will understand, you don't want a written record of what you've said because it's a lot harder to dispute those words than to be able to say, well, you're misremembering what I've said.
My question was...
Wait a minute. The trouble is in the modern world is when you have evidence that somebody said something, it's dismissed as being not reliable and not true anyway. So that undermines that argument totally. It's going on at the very moment. Look, the real reason for keeping records, in my opinion, is to do with to combat the arrogance of the human race, because the human beings believe that they are the apogee of creation and they are the forefront of evolution and they are marvelous and flawless. And when you know anything about history, you see how wrong that is. There is no progress in the human race. There is no learning from error. There's no learning from experience. People blunder around like a load of chimpanzees on a rugby pitch. And if you have written resources from earlier times, and if they are made available to the world when the world is a civilized world instead of the mess in which we live, there's a lesson from history which is a crucial thing that you have to learn from experience. You have to know that war never, ever, ever does any good. Why don't we know this yet? And the only way that people will understand this is if they know about the wars that happened, and people don't know about what happened in the Second World War. They don't know what happened in the First. So it's only with records that you can stand up and say that this is what happened, this is what we know happened. That's the real reason.
I mean, with that, I just ask, well, who's writing those records?
Well, that's another matter.
And who has access to that technology to write them?
With any kind of literature, the reader has to interpret. And most records have an agenda. But you're a fool if you believe everything without contemplating how it reflects its time, how it reflects the person, how it reflects religion. You always have to interpret. But if you don't have the resources, you haven't got anything to interpret. And it's really important to know what happened before. I mean, I had a general on Radio 4 being interviewed when he came back from Afghanistan. You know, he sat down in the chair and they asked him what it was like. He said, I'll tell you something. Afghanistan's a hell of a bad place to have a war. We're not going there again. As if we'll go down to, when we feel in a militant mood, we'll go down to the newsagent and find a report about good countries to go and have a war in. But he didn't know anything that had happened in Afghanistan before. He didn't know anything about it. That is incredible to me. So that illustrates in a minor way the crucial nature of history being brought alive and rescued. And I'll tell you one other thing which is rather interesting. Google Translate. Everybody uses this, and then they pretend they can read Italian. But the interesting thing about Google Translate is their professed ambition. Because we dealt with them in the museum, they came to see us. We went and learned to find out what their names were. They were all like Mr. 1 and Mr. 2 and Mr. 3. So when we talked to them, we were Mr. 19 and Mr. 38. That showed them. Anyway, the point about it is this. Their plan is to find a computer system whereby any language in the world can be translated into any other language in the world. Not French into Swedish, but all of them. This is their ambition. That's a very interesting perspective, and it also shows me that underneath the existence of independent languages, it no longer has to be stubborn and irritating, because with this development, many of the problems of all these languages being existent can be removed. Because at the beginning, it was terrible, the translation. You could see it was done by somebody with a dictionary and there was no grammar and everything. But now, even already, it is extraordinary.
I'm perfectly happy to surrender my mic at this point in time and take questions from the audience. What we're going to do is, in the interest of time, take a couple of questions together. And if you could also say who you'd like, who your question is addressed to, that would be fantastic. Can we start with the lady here? And I'll come to you, sir. I'll come to you. No, the lady there in green, please. Sorry.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm curious about how changing script affects not just sort of language in the sense of how it's written, but also grammar and usage and pronunciation. And specifically, I worked in Central Asia, so that's my context, where you had, during Sovietization, you had local languages that were once written in Persian that uses diacritic marks for vowels, then changed to the Cyrillic script, which writes out vowels. And then in independence, there was this huge, this was in the late 90s, around early turn of the century, there was this huge debate about whether to go back to Persian or to maintain Cyrillic, or to follow the example of Turkey and adopt the Latin script. And obviously the language changed because of those decisions. So I'd like to just find out what you think about that.
I thought I'll take a couple of questions, but that is a complicated question. So maybe if one of you would like to...
I think this is the first time I've ever been at a talk and had a question about Central Asia, and I'm delighted. I feel validated now in my educational choices. But I also think it's a fascinating question, because often script change comes about with other changes. So many of the languages for Central Asia and the Caucasus, the Turkic ones, were written in a Perso-Arabic script up until about 1926, and then they actually used Latin for about a decade, and then Cyrillic, and then many now have switched back to a Latin script or found a new Latin version. I think in the 1920s and 30s, you see parallel developments where the script change is only one of a number of different reforms enacted by the Soviet authorities, because everything is about showing a change. So they changed the grammar, they changed the script, they changed the pronunciation and the vowels. But I think for the most part, there's a greater change between using Perso-Arabic script and, say, Latin or Cyrillic than between Cyrillic and Latin. So the grammar doesn't change that much whether you're going to use Latin or Cyrillic, or the perception of the language, because they're both alphabets. So it's the same sort of logic, one sound, one letter. But between Arabic script and Latin script, or between Arabic script and Cyrillic, Arabic script works without the vowels, and part of the reason is because the speaker will know how to fill those vowels in based on the grammar, based on the way that the Arabic language works. So you can add one letter, one particular vowel if it's a passive form, a different one if it's an active form, and you know that from the context. Turkic languages don't work like that. So there is a lot of debate about the idea of needing to have an alphabet, because Turkic languages work differently from Arabic ones. And the transfer over from Arabic script into Cyrillic or Latin meant that you no longer had this ambiguity. And so that had to be marked out clearly. And people would begin to understand those forms and conceive of them differently, because they no longer worked with the way that they were conceived of under the Arabic script. But now they were made they were made explicit through this use of Latin or Cyrillic. And it really brought that to the fore of how you would form a passive, how you would implicate all of these different grammatical forms without the use of the Arabic structure, which was in some ways foreign to that idea, the logic, internal logic of the Turkic languages.
Thank you. The gentleman over there in red, and then the gentleman in front, please.
This is a question for Mr. Finkel. If you had a choice of communicating by telephone, would you rather text or speak to the person?
drives me mad is when people phone you up and say, "Did you get my email?"
Thank you.
I want to speak in defense of David, because I think there's evidence to suggest that language is a very poor form of communication. And I think quite often in modern world, when people are short time and want to communicate very quickly, they tend to have an addition to language with emojis. I understand that 70% of communication is actually non-verbal in any case. And because we are now so glued to our screens, we need that additional nuance that Irving talked about. So I hate emojis as much as you do, but I think they do serve a subtle purpose of nuancing the language that is already deficient in fully communicating, despite the OECD and the thesauruses that we have. We don't all have access nor the intellectual ability to use all the words that are in the OECD. So I think there is something about language that actually. So my question is there further down the temporal setting and the stage, is there a time when perhaps language will evolve sufficiently to communicate ideas, particularly communicate emotions?
Well, I will just start with that again, say that I think prediction is a very dicey thing, but I'm with both of you. I'm with Irving too, in the sense that, I mean, look, we are not giving up on script and language by any means. In fact, I don't know how many of you remember that 20, 25 years ago, people were beginning to say that images were going to be everything. And now look at the extent to which people actually are writing using email, using texting, using social media. The only argument I'm trying to make, which is, after this, I will get Irving to help me figure out how to solve my problem about emoji. Oh, the truth is, I don't use them that much, but I'm willing to play the emoji user for the moment. But I think what we're seeing is that language does a very good job with emotion in the right genres and the right context. What are novels about, right? What are stories? Storytelling is a beautiful form of the use of language orally and textually to evoke all of this. What's happening is that as we evolve more communicative means and genres, we didn't have texting before, we didn't have Twitter, we're trying to figure out within communities of use what quality of expression we want, and we're searching for methods of that. One of the things I've learned from my young students, for example, undergraduates, around texting, is because texting has been such in some sense, linguistically impoverished mechanism with a very short amount of space to write anything, that young people have tended to try to read meaning into whether there's punctuation in it or not. Is there a period at the end or not? Or how quickly did my friend or my partner respond to me? In other words, we're working on, in this new clay, trying to figure out what the expressive mechanisms will be. And it seems to me that emojis are just one very interesting direction. But I don't think they're going to supplant anything particular.
I know I sort of brought this up to play the devil's advocate, but this is a sort of false debate between language and emojis. I mean, there isn't there isn't. That's for that matter. We could be talking about coding versus language, or maps versus language, or so on and so forth. But on the subject of language being deficient, any quick thoughts, Irving?
Well, I'm probably boring. I think that when people read literature, their mastery and use of their language is massively extended. And libraries are closing down. All my kids, as far as I can tell, without interrogation with pointed needles, none of them has ever read a book from beginning to end. So the actual fabric whereby vocabulary is acquired, and the actual ray that goes into your mind about how to have a balanced sentence with precise meaning has just disappeared from the entire landscape. So, I mean, my daughter uses the word, to go, or to have gone, or should have gone, or went, to mean to speak. Now, this bewilders the hell out of me because in Sumerian, we have a separate verb to go, to walk, and a separate verb to speak. Now, what happens if we've got it wrong too? What happens if when we read these 5,000-year-old messages, when they're saying they went somewhere, they actually meant they said something? I mean, and the thing is, if you take one of these kids on their own, you have to isolate them from their herd. If you take one of them and you try to ask them to justify something, they are all over the place because they don't have the training in thinking and speaking and arguing, even in defense of their idiocy. So I feel this needs to be attended to.
Thank you. The gentleman over here, please, and then there was a question in the back, the lady.
I have a question about the Indus Valley script. So I'll bring everybody back thousands of years. I have spent time as a teenager in Mohenjo-daro and 20 years ago in Babylon. And I'm really have questions about 500 alphabets of the Indus script, and the cuneiform can be read now, and it says that Meluha, which they're talking about Mohenjo-daro, and there are Mohenjo-daro seals in Ur. How far are we from really deciphering the Indus script? Most of the things are in the seals, and thousands of them. Even in Oman, they have Indus Valley seals. But in Dholavira, in Gujarat, there's a big sign of Indus script of 10 alphabets, which is almost like it may be saying welcome or something. So can you please?
Well, the big lintel in Dholavira, I mentioned it briefly before, shows that the writing system is a proper writing system. And the thing is this, that we know that the people from that culture traded with people in southern Iraq because these seals are there. So that we know that the people in the Indus Valley civilization were familiar with cuneiform writing because they were in the city and they'd seen it. So we also have a seal of a Babylonian from about 2600 who is described as a Melucha interpreter. So there were people in Babylonia or in southern Iraq who could speak this language. This is a remarkable matter. So the only way we will jump forward is simply to find an inscription. Now, it is always possible with archaeology that something amazing will happen, and until we find a bilingual or some other piece of evidence like that, I don't think what we have in those characters is enough for decipherment, because some very clever people have been preoccupied with that for 60 or 70 years, and everything possible has been tried using computers and so forth. So we just have to wait.
They say that there's IIT Kanpur is working on a Rosetta Stone or something.
Yes. Well, you know about YouTube, presumably. You're familiar with it. Yes. Well, there you are. You see, you can find anything you like on YouTube. I get letters from people who've deciphered the Indus Valley script in their bedroom and such places, probably 3 or 4 times a month. You know, I mean, it's...
Okay, I'm really sorry, I'm being told that we're out of time.
This is people.
That's really not up to me, but we do have books by Irving and David in the bookshop. They're going to be around right outside to sign the books, I think, and also perhaps if they are in the mood, they could answer a couple of questions. And do not forget to go check out the exhibition that Michael has curated in the British Library on this subject. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you. Thank you, Irving. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David.